Let me present you to anyone that might not know who you are. You're Ed Cooke. You are the author of Remember, Learn the Stuff You Never Thought You Could. You're also a Grandmaster of Memory and the co-founder of Memrise. Can you tell me a bit about Memrise, please?
Sure. So Memrise is a company I've been running for 10 years. It's a language learning app. We have about 50 million people who've used it. It applies lots of kind of techniques of learning and memory to the task of language acquisition. Yeah, you can find it on the app stores and that sort of thing.
So I guess those techniques were very useful in your memory contests, and you also carry the Grandmaster of Memory title. Can you please tell me what that entails?
Yeah, so to become a Grandmaster of Memory, which is a title given out at memory competitions, you need to remember a 1,000-digit number in an hour and a pack of cards in fewer than 2 minutes. And you know, I first started competing in memory competitions in 2004 when I was in my last year as a student of psychology and philosophy, doing it just mainly for the fun of things. But the techniques which allowed me to do that, which are broadly the repertoire of memory techniques, subsequently allowed me to kind of pull off, to go beyond those levels, to learn a pack of cards in 45 seconds, to learn 16 decks of cards in an hour, or and these types of things.
So how long have you been into the art of memory?
So I got into it at the age of 18 when I was struck down by an illness. I ended up with 3 months in hospital due to a thing called post-viral arthritis, which affects young people, but which is not, fortunately, something which kind of damages you super long term. But anyway, I ended up in this arthritis ward for 3 months, had nothing to do, was surrounded by old people who were kind of telling the same anecdotes all the time. And so I thought, okay, I'll resolve to teach myself memory techniques. So that's what I did. I learned from a book by Dominic O'Brien, who's the 7 times world memory champion. And I kind of learned these cool techniques for memorizing stuff, which have, by the way, been known since the ancient Greeks, and quickly became pretty proficient to the point where I could kind of compete in the, but by the time I left, I was at a pretty good standard. And, I would recommend, by the way, to anybody the opportunity to spend 3 months in bed, because it really is a great opportunity a great scene in which to get good at a skill.
So besides, I don't know, international fame, did these skills enrich your life in any form?
So, I'm a big believer that memory is at the heart of lots of other aspects of cognition. So, it's at the heart of thought, it's the heart of perception, it's the heart of language, obviously. And there are different qualities of memory you can identify, but the value of learning memory techniques and more generally of learning stuff is that it changes how you perceive the world. So and it changes how you can act in the world too. A trivial example is like you learn a language, and then you can speak to people in that language. That opens up a whole world to you. You learn loads of poetry, which I have at various points in my life, and that gives you opportunities to experience the world through the lens of that poetry, to notice new things, to be sensitive to it, to be able to articulate it, but also just fun things like you're around a campfire and you can dish out a bit of poetry and entertain everybody. So I think that there is something inherently enriching, both about kind of techniques of learning and actually learning stuff.
Is there anything you have trouble remembering?
Yeah, I don't remember very well things to do unless I write them down. And I'm not hugely good at remembering to do things at points in time. So, for example, if it's like take a cake out of the oven in 45 minutes, I will struggle. In a way, that's not really memory. That's attention, and that's actually an interesting phenomenon. Which is that you actually remember the cake is in the oven. If someone says, "Where's the cake?" it's in the oven, but you just haven't thought of it at the appropriate time. So Also, I also struggle at sometimes to. I'm not. I'm not brilliant at perceiving faces. There were wide variations in how well people can distinguish faces, and I'm at the slightly blurrier end of the spectrum. So I'm not a genius at remembering faces, but typically speaking, um, anybody can get good at remembering almost anything, and there's just a sustained process of practice and attention that allows that to happen.
So I guess this shows that a lot of the memory techniques which you have mastered don't really apply to sort of all domains. I mean, I was wondering how could those techniques help not only with remembering taking something out of the oven, but what about your own autobiography? Can you improve your ability to recall the past experiences that you went through? Because I know that a lot of people are able to do this at a very impressive rate, and some others don't seem to be able to recall things that they went through.
Yeah, some of the things that contribute to good autobiographical memory are actually just they're just how how you naturally apply what is well understood about what installs memories. So, a great technique, for example, for remembering your life better is to have the habit at the end of each day of running through your day in your mind. And that simple act of repetition, it's going, da, 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 da. Oh yeah, and what was the name of the woman I met for coffee at 11 a.m.? Okay, yeah, Erin. Okay, cool. And so on. Even that mere fact of actual repetition drives better recall. People, you obviously get better. You obviously remember well anecdotes you tell a lot. So, the act of practicing, of actively recalling your experiences, actively contributes to how clear your autobiographical memory is. And I would recommend those practices. Sometimes I'm so busy that weeks become a bit of a blur, and that's because there's no space to actually go over and tease apart and digest and compost those memories. Um, so I'd say actually that in summary, that memory techniques, namely repetition, active recall, imagination, etc., apply very well to autobiographical memory. To the earlier question on how generalizable are memory techniques, well, I think that the way to think about this is that the different contexts demand very different structures of memory. And therefore, the way you remember stuff and the way you pay attention will create performance in particular ways. And as you mentioned, memory palaces are great for remembering sequences. But if you want to remember the meaning of words, then they're not in sequence. You want to be able to uh, randomly access any one of those memories. And so that calls for a slightly different approach. If you want to remember the cake is in the oven, you've got to install a memory which will be triggered in 45 minutes time. Normally, it's easiest to do that with an alarm, but there are other ways of doing it. And so, yeah, horses for courses when it comes to memory.
I have to ask this question because a lot of people might have never heard about memory techniques. And I want to tell them, if you may will, to share your secrets. How do you memorize a deck of cards in less than 45 seconds?
So there are three broad principles to memory, one of which is, well, in fact, the overriding principle is make stuff interesting through the power of association. So with a pack of cards, the individual cards are actually quite boring. Seven of hearts, three of diamonds, six of clubs. They're not very differentiated. They're kind of all the same. And so there's this technique of associating them with things which are more interesting, like people. So you could be Teddy. You could be the king of whatever, king of hearts, if you like. Um, and I could choose various friends and celebrities to correspond to all the other cards. And then it's like a vocabulary. This takes like a couple of hours to learn. So when you look at a particular card, every time I look at the seven of clubs, I'm like, okay, Tiger Woods. Uh, every time I look at the three of diamonds, it's a friend of mine. Every time I look at the nine of hearts, that's another friend of mine. The queen of hearts, another, and there's rather boring examples. They're all friends, but my kind of repertoire of characters is sort of a mixture of friends, celebrities, mythical figures, sports people, blah blah blah. And by having this kind of vocabulary of images, you have automatically made the cards much more memorable. In the same way that, if you know loads about a person, you, and you are interested in all those aspects of them, you're likely to kind of remember meeting them much more than if you meet someone about whom you know nothing, because there's more richness, there's more association, there's more texture there. So that's the first step in remembering a pack of cards, is to have images for all the cards. And the second step is to arrange them in a kind of memory palace. And a memory palace is like a spatial technique drawn from the fact that we're very, very good at remembering spaces naturally, due to basically 400 million years of mammalian evolution, which means that we're just very, very good at some deep cognitive level at perceiving, remembering, navigating spaces. And basically, the memory palace techniques leverages this power to structure information in sequences, because we very easily remember sequences around spaces. And so what you do is you arrange the images around a space which is familiar to you. You might begin in your bedroom or in your office or your school or your campus or whatever. And you arrange the images in a sequence around that space. And when you come to recall them, you just retrace that path in your imagination. And then, okay, we got David Beckham by the door. I go through the door, on into the corridor, and there's, Britney Spears. And then we go down the stairs, and there's B.A. Baracus from the A-Team, and then blah, 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 blah. And so, yeah, this is basically how it works. And what's interesting is that, having learned the associations, as soon as you look at a card, you're not really seeing the card, you're seeing the person, and you're just forming the images at about the pace you form an image in a conversation. If I'm like, okay, the Queen threw a tennis ball at Roger Federer, who threw a bucket, over a wall, where it landed on whatever Dominic Cummings, and Dominic Cummings began to cry, and then kicked the Pope, and the Pope was angry. Whatever. You can all understand this, and you can form these images very fast. And it turns out that when structured nicely in space, even half a second or a second is enough to leave a trace that you can recall in a couple of minutes afterwards.
We've talked about memory, but can you please tell us, how does forgetting occur?
Well, memory and forgetting go hand in hand. For a deep philosophical reason, which is really beautifully explored, by the way. And there's a wonderful Borges short story called Funes the Memorious, which illustrates the fact that a memory which remembers everything is a non-functional memory. The role of memory is to categorize and to simplify and relate knowledge to the world. And if you remembered everything, and it's explored in the story, you would have a distinct memory for not just every leaf that you'd ever seen in your life, but every leaf at every moment in time, because that moment in time is part of the appearance and context of that leaf. And it would become absurd to just have a single word, leaf, which covers all of these obviously distinct and equally memorable cases. And you quickly get to a kind of point, if you kind of explore the consequences of perfect memory, that it would dissolve the functional purpose of memory, which is to allow you to navigate and make decisions on the basis of a kind of condensation of previous experience. And so, how does forgetting occur? Well, forgetting is baked into neural structures at a really kind of fundamental level. And for example, if you take something like spaced repetition, which is one of the great principles of memory, spaced repetition says that if you recall something on repeated occasions, that memory becomes much stronger. Okay, very good. And one of the observations is that the gaps between those recalls can grow exponentially and have great impact. So you learn a word, and on Memrise we will remind you in like a minute, and then half an hour, and then an hour, and then a day, and then a week, and then a month, and a year, roughly. But and we adapt that with cool tech. But and so we adapt that with cool tech, and you might ask, well, why does it work like this? Why is repetition so important? Well, the underlying reason is because repetition shows us what's worth remembering. And we want to capture significance. We want to capture significance amid the noise, and therefore the brain is quite well tuned to only bother remembering the things which are actually repeating patterns in the world. Otherwise, we'd be overwhelmed by all the random connections of oh, there's a pot plant with a grey shadow 2 feet to your left. If random combinations of perceptual stimuli were distinctly remembered like that, we would not be able to navigate the world.
But what about cases when, I don't know, a thought just escapes your mind, not about things that you learned, I don't know, a month ago and you can't remember it anymore? When it seems to happen instantaneously and you just spend time remembering what you're thinking about and you can't do it, even though you just had it on your mind.
Yeah, that is an interesting case. Memories are always effectively stored in contexts. The underlying reason for which is that memories are always connections to other memories, and so this is, by the way, why spatial memory systems work so well. You have a thought, and often when wandering around, you'll pass a place where you had a thought or a conversation, and you remember that thought or conversation in that space. And so that's part of context, is the space, and that's how all memory is organized. Now, typically, if you have a thought and then you can't, and then very shortly afterwards you can't remember it, it's because you've changed mental context, and the new mental context no longer contains that thought. And the way to then find that thought is to go back to the previous mental context, which is why in conversations we're like, where were we? Okay, we were talking about Manchester United, and then we began to talk about whatever, Eric Cantona. We began thinking about French cheese. Oh yeah, I meant to talk to you about and so you trace through the context, and then at some point on that journey, the thought will become visible. Now, the more abstract our thinking, the less easy it is to reproduce context. And by the way, the more abstract things are, the less the easier they are to manipulate in any way in the mind, which is why diagrams are so useful. And it's why metaphors underlie the vast majority of abstract thought. And it's why there's something inherently more difficult to relate to and remember in arcane philosophy than there is in more conventional storytelling.
Can you please debunk a memory myth for us?
Yeah, sure. So probably the greatest memory myth is that photographic memory exists, which is a very unhelpful metaphor, unhelpful myth, because in comparison to photographic memory, everyone, of course, feels they're rather hopeless. And on repeated occasions of my life, I was told, "Oh, this classmate there, she's got a photographic memory," and normally what they actually mean by that is she's got a decent memory and she can kind of remember where stuff was on the page.
Right.
So it's more normally a kind of gestural spatial sense, which we all have. And the reason that photographic memory is such a damaging and useless idea is we don't even have photographic perception. Our perception is extremely extremely unlike a photograph in how it happens. I mean, at all sorts of levels. I mean, you could look at it at the level of resolution, where only right at the center of our eyes, on the fovea, do we have kind of high resolution vision. And actually, our kind of peripheral visual field is actually very, very low resolution. But you don't actually experience it that way, because as soon as you want to get any detail, you move your eyes, and then you get the full high bandwidth resolution of the center of the eye. And because you have dispositional access to a highly detailed visual scene, intuitively you think you just have that in your mind. But perception itself is not photographic, and we only ever remember things we've kind of processed in a way at a high level. So you'll never have a memory where you'll be thinking back to a moment, someone's birthday party, and then you're like, oh, what's that on the shelf behind them? That can't happen. You can only access something which you perceived in the first place.
So I guess there's a lot of editing that the brain does, which gives the illusion that we take all the world in. Because when you first tell someone that you don't have photographic perception, they might be surprised by the claim, because it certainly feels like that. So I guess this goes hand in hand with how you pay attention, because you have phenomena like inattentional blindness or change blindness, which shows that you might be under the impression that you take the whole world in, but essentially you miss out a lot of what's happening in your perceptual field. Can you please tell us what you think about the relationship between memory and attention?
So you touched on a couple of very interesting things there. Um, so let me begin by saying that there's a famous Dr. Johnson quote: "The art of memory is really the art of attention," um, which is pretty spot on, because most of memory techniques are about manipulating attention in clever ways to make information more meaningful, to organize it in a fashion that that sticks, and so on. And we all know anecdotally that if you pay a lot of attention to stuff, you tend to remember it. And I go so far as to say the vast majority of forgetting isn't really forgetting; it's just not paying attention in the first place. You're at a drinks party, you're introduced to 4 people, you're not really listening, and suddenly, oh, I've forgotten their names. Well, quite often you didn't really listen to the names in the first place. So there's a kind of attention is what sustains the input into memory in the first place. You mentioned a couple of interesting phenomena which have been well studied in cognitive science, including inattentional blindness and change blindness. And so change blindness, which was actually discovered by a guy called Kevin O'Regan, whose lab I worked in for a couple of years as a postgrad, and he had a very interesting interpretation of the fact that you can take a kind of photograph of a scene, someone blinks, and then you change the scene in some massive way. You move a church 20 yards, you entirely remove the reflection from the surface of the water, something else happens. And there's also an interesting demonstration of a gorilla walking across a basketball scene, which many people will see, will have seen. But his argument is that we have very low bandwidth sort of input in our perception of the world, but the illusion that we have high bandwidth input is not based on the brain filling anything in, which he would take to be a kind of almost like a Cartesian error. And the thought experiment he suggests to get your head around the idea that nothing requires to be filled in is to take the example of the retina, the back of the eye, where the light strikes and creates electrical signals which go into the brain and starts vision off. In the case of the retina, he points out there's this blind spot, which is where the bundle of optical fibers are in the middle of the retina. And there's loads of research in psychology about filling in the blind spot. But his point is that like the blind spot doesn't know it's blind because it's blind. It's like it's not looking. It can't see the absence of light because it can't see light. And so in the same way as if you're like an ant on the 3D surface of a ball or something, and you're walking around and around and around, it might feel very 2D, and it would never enter your imagination that you were missing out on a third dimension. I think similarly with detail, which is not present in the mind, you don't have to, for the mind to have the illusion that things are more detailed than they are. We don't have to create an extra capacity in the mind for imagining that detail and then filling it in. We can just say the scope of our imagination of detail is fundamentally constrained to what it is, so we can't imagine ourselves beyond the level of detail that we're seeing.
You say that the art of memory is the art of paying attention, but what about cases where you have memories of things that never happened? I mean, false memories. And what about how this impacts the eyewitnesses reports that are sometimes used by the police, but nowadays with care because all of the research that has been done in this area. So how can you remember something that you never paid attention to because it never happened?
Well, I mean, you can pay attention to memories, and you can pay attention to things you imagine. So there's no contradiction between attention and things that didn't happen. I actually had the other day a quite interesting experience of false memory, but I would explain it as being false perception in the first place. And basically, I was working late. It was about 3 a.m, and I heard like a shuffling in the neighbor's garden. And I called out, and the shuffling continued. And then a short while later, I saw someone turned on a torch and then turned off the torch. And I was like, oh my God. And so clearly it was a person doing all the shuffling sort of thing. And then the shuffling continued. And the next day I bumped into my neighbor and I was like, by the way, I was a little bit worried last night, that someone was in your garden. And they were like, oh no, that was just the foxes. And I was like, oh right, the foxes. But no, it couldn't have been foxes because I saw someone with a torch. And they were like, no. And in fact, I'd recalled seeing a torch with a person underneath it. And they were like, no, but at that time I went out and I turned on the automatic security light. It flickered on or whatever. And so my memory was that, and therefore my experience of the whole scene, piecing these things together, had been there was someone shuffling around, searching under a shed, messing around, who then turned on a torch, and I connected all these things together into a single percept. And it turned out that I'd misperceived the torch. That was actually a security light. I'd misperceived the connection between the security light and the foxes, which I didn't know were there. And so it's an example of basically a false piece of eyewitness testimony, but where the illusion largely happened in perception in the first place.
Are you aware of any interesting case where it wasn't an illusion of perception?
Oh, for sure. So, every time you recall a memory, you alter that memory through the act of recollection. And there are very interesting phenomena where, for example, you begin to remember scenes in your life just naturally from the outside, i.e. not from a perspective which you were at. So you remember childhood scenes, but you're a participant in the scene, filmed from the air or something. And there's also, lots of examples in the case of how our photographs of events become our dominant memories of them, even though they weren't necessarily our own view at the time.
Right.
And so these are all examples of how, memory is inherently mutable, and while there is some sense in which we recall states of perception and that states of perception get called, those states themselves are fallible. They get continuously altered in the act of recollection. And so we're looking at something very, very different from a computer database.
You mentioned that you had interest in consciousness when you applied to university, and now I guess some time has passed. So with your own knowledge that you've gathered on memory, do you think there's any hope on using the knowledge that we have about memory on shedding light on what's known as the hard problem of consciousness?
So, yeah, the hard problem of consciousness is, David Chalmers's formulation for the difficulty we have in relating what we can imagine about physical brain states and subjective experience. And so, it's a problem which, in order to sort of to understand the problem and perceive that it's hard, you often want to go to examples based on what are called secondary qualities of the perception. So colors, smells, drifting into emotions and the textures of sounds, where there seems to be this kind of qualitative content going on that's very, very different from anything we can easily imagine relating to brain activity. It's worth noting that it's more difficult to state the hard problem of consciousness when we think about aspects of perceptual states, such as the perception of shape or depth or illumination, that are more obviously physical in nature. No one finds it very difficult to imagine why you're perceiving a square and you experience squareness. Mm-hmm. And so anyway, that's just some thoughts on the kind of the formulation of the problem. It's a very interesting area of philosophy of mind, and funny enough, that the scientist I mentioned earlier, Kevin O'Regan, has a quite comprehensive theory of consciousness, which isn't super related to memory, but I can relate it. Quite a comprehensive theory of consciousness, which I think does an extremely good job of dissolving the potency of the hard problem by showing how secondary qualities like color and smell and sound emerge out of our sensory motor relationship to the environment. And so, his theory kind of begins with an explanation, which is like if you have a bottle in your hand and your eyes closed, even though with your eyes closed you can only feel a small part of the surface of the bottle, you have a sense of its shape through the air. It doesn't feel just like a mug, it feels thing. And so, through that and a number of other examples, he kind of shows that how we relate to the world perceptually is substantially kind of determined by our knowledge of sensory motor contingencies. And a sensory motor contingency is the kind of the relationship between input and output as we move. So if I move my hand around the bottle, there was a certain set of expectations I'll have about what the feedback will be from that process of exploration. And in his research program, he did wonderful work in showing how smells, tastes, colors, and our sense of space itself derive from like law-like patterns of sensory motor contingencies, which we have to have knowledge of, and therefore memory, in order to use. And so, according to such a theory, that intuitive, which would be more like procedural knowledge of our of where we are in the kind of the state space of our relationship to the world, the full gamut of possible movements that we could make and their likely sensory consequences, structured dynamically through time. So it's not just a single step, but structured out through time, it determines the qualitative feel of any given experience. And that goes a long way towards solving, once you get into the details, most of the soft problems of consciousness, which are used to justify the existence of the hard problem of consciousness. However, having said all that, as time has gone on, I have become more and more struck by my experiences of states of consciousness where simplicity of cognition, states of extreme tiredness sometimes, or deep meditative purity, how states of extreme purity of consciousness seem to lead to enormous amplification of consciousness. And that is difficult to square with what are essentially quite functional explanations for qualitative feel, all of which basically leads me to a position of panpsychism, but that's a whole other story.
In our last minutes, can you please tell us about the work that you do at Memrise? How did this idea start and what exactly do you do?
So, yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, so Memrise is a language learning app, and we're one of the most used ones in the world. We have tens of millions of users, and it all began with the intention of basically creating the ultimate learning system. It's like, okay, we know all this stuff about the art and science of memory. How do we combine this together into a system which basically would help anybody learn like a genius? And that's the kind of core technology which underlies Memrise. And we began to focus on languages after a while, because that's what most of our learners were learning. And over time, we have built this set of language experiences which try and combine these two things, intellect and emotion, which is one way of talking about the essence of memory. So the technique of repetition and testing and layering information in your brain, so you kind of learn incredibly fast. And on the other hand, the emotion which makes you pay attention and makes you care and makes the memories rich and interesting and fun enough to actually stick in the memory. So there's lots of videos of native speakers in context. There's lots of content which you immerse in, which really helps you. Forgive the police car, by the way. The lots of content which you have to immerse in, which really kind of connects you emotionally to the country and to the people who speak it, and so on and so forth. And all in all, it gives rise to a kind of an experience of language learning which is quite joyful and can help you understand real world language, which is the key task.
Thanks a lot for this interview. I mean, I was really interested in memory for a long time, and I was glad that I was able to talk to a memory grandmaster.
Hey, my pleasure, my pleasure. And yeah, it's been great being on the show. Thank you very much for interviewing me, and lovely to talk about some of these more philosophical aspects of memory.